So our focus this week is on escalation of the Vietnam conflict. And typically, we talk a great deal about escalation in terms of the United States, right? And we talked last week about their concerns and their thoughts in terms of the Kennedy administration on escalation. But you notice in this week's material that we also talk a great deal about escalation in the North and sort of the ramping up of the tactics and the ramping up of really the objectives of the North in terms of the South of Vietnam. And so this obviously is in direct correlation with the coup in 1963. So the North Vietnamese right after that recognized that they in order to really stave off any sort of implantation of the United States in the South and to really destroy South Vietnam, that the only way they were going to be able to do that is to have rapid military escalation. And so they decided to not only commit personnel but significant amounts of supplies to the South in terms of the Viet Cong. And so this is something that they recognize, at least tactically, that they believe that it's going to send South Vietnam into complete chaos, right? And they're hoping that in creating that chaos, the United States is just going to withdraw. And they're basically going to be like, well, we saw what happened with the French and we don't want to get embroiled in that, and so we're just going to throw in the towel. And obviously the United States is not interested in doing that. And that has there are a plethora of reasons for this, right? I mean, that's really not what the United States has ever done up to this point in terms of its military. But also the suggestion is that, just as we talked about last week, in the idea of international communism, right? Or the natural resources of Vietnam. And so the United States isn't going to leave. And so it's kind of a mistake on the part of those in North Vietnam suggesting that the United States would. And the United States was not going to do that. We know that. So there's significant escalation in the summer of 1964, and there's massive mobilization of Vietnamese forces and North Vietnamese forces, and they're sent into South Vietnam. They also create the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or I shouldn't say create it, they modernized it from the first Indochina War. And so there's this significant focus on, how are we going to infiltrate the South, and what are we going to do when we get in there, because the hope clearly is that they're going to push the United States out. Now, in March of 1964, we see the United States suggesting that they're going to move toward rapid escalation as well. And as we know, escalation at this point in time is clearly going to be bombings, right? But in March of 1964, there's this official pledge to help South Vietnam. And there's this official pledge to make sure that South Vietnam is not just kept away from the North Vietnamese quote-unquote communist forces, but also that the South Vietnam is not able to become a satellite of international communism, right? Whether we're talking about the USSR or we're talking about China. And so this is a point in time where the United States is getting ready to say, okay, this is our policy now. This is how we're going to move forward, and our recognition here is that we are making sure that there's no spread of international communism, and this is how we're going to do it. And if it takes bombs and if it takes troops, so be it, right? They solely want to protect South Vietnam from communism, not just again from the North, but also from the USSR and also China. So Johnson, initially, his policy is very much like Kennedy's, and the idea is to send more assistance, send more military assistance, more economic assistance, right? He also pledged in March of 1964 that they are going to work hard to suppress any additional coups, and that they're also going to prepare the forces of the South Vietnamese army for warfare with the North. And so there's this connotation to this that the United States is not going to jump into any sort of particularly ground combat, right? That they're not going to be sending in ground troops. But as we know, eventually that's not the case. But we can clearly see in the spring of 1964 that a lot of the meditations on this that the Kennedy administration had done were going to be coming to fruition in the Johnson administration. And although Johnson really steps away from the idea of, oh, let's put in troops on the ground, he clearly is going to very quickly recognize that there needs to be bombings if what the United States wants to do in terms of the North Vietnamese and, you know, getting rid of them and then staving off international communism, that's really going to be the only thing that they can do. So recognize the fact that we're not necessarily talking about ground troops at this point, but clearly this is something that was already on the table, right, in the Kennedy administration, even though Kennedy shied away from it. But recognize that, and you know, as we move forward, sort of see how we inch toward the idea of ground troops. So very quickly after the United States pledges this support to South Vietnam, we see that there's a very new focus of the United States military and those advisors that are in South Vietnam. There's a very new focus on North Vietnam and what the United States can do in North Vietnam, just not, you know, from afar in South Vietnam, but within North Vietnam, to weaken the forces in North Vietnam and try to save South Vietnam from any sort of a takeover. And we see more covert operations that are going on because they haven't fully committed, again, to the United States fully stepping in militarily. So we see a lot of intelligence flights. We see propaganda being dropped, particularly in the rural countryside. We see a lot of raids in terms of particularly the Viet Cong and trying to rout out the Viet Cong in terms of the countryside. But we're going to expand it very quickly to bombings in the North. So if the North does something to the United States, so that's why I have tit for tat here, the North does something to the United States, whatever it is, the United States will retaliate with bombings, right? They're going to be focused on very specific targets at first. And they're also going to be looking into what's going on in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. So we can see very quickly in the spring of 1964 that Johnson's eyes are on something much larger, right? That it's not just this initial policy of, you know, let's try to save South Vietnam, let's try to help South Vietnam fight against the North. You can already see there are a great deal of plans being put in place, well beyond bombings too, right? That the United States is going to get very quickly embroiled here. They're going to get very, very quickly embroiled in the fight to save South Vietnam for, again, whatever reason, right? You can put all the plethora of them on the table, but the United States is very quickly not only promising things to South Vietnam, which we're going to see fall apart in the end, right? These grand promises that the United States gives to South Vietnam, as the South Vietnamese believe the United States that these promises are going to come true. But we really see that the United States is not just promising things, but there's a lot of action that's being put into place, and the action itself is going to escalate rapidly as well. Well, the sordid Gulf of Tonkin incident is really what really sets all of these plans into further forward motion, right? Not just in terms of the United States, but also in terms of North Vietnam. And we talked about that idea of tit for tat bombing in terms of the United States and what they were going to do with North Vietnam. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident really sets up the idea that the United States absolutely must do this. Okay, they absolutely must retaliate every time that the North Vietnamese were able to hit some sort of strategic target, or that the United States sees the North Vietnamese as having done something against them, right? And so for the United States, this really, you know, changes what they've been doing and how they've been operating for a very long time. That they're sort of centered there in the South, and they're pushing back against the North, and any sort of strides that the North makes toward the South, they push back. Well, this isn't pushing back anymore, right? The United States is jumping into the North, and this starts that sort of flood into the North militarily for the United States. Well, that flood also accelerates the North Vietnamese and their attempts not only to push into the South, but also to allow the Viet Cong to blossom in the South as well. And so, the Vietnamese believe that the United States really is expanding this conflict and maybe even expanding it into full-blown warfare, right? And so for the North Vietnamese, the idea here is, okay, we already said that we're going to change this sort of moderate tone that we have, and this sort of inching toward things and hoping for negotiation, right? There's no hope of negotiation for the North Vietnamese at this point. They really don't believe that that's anything that can happen, and they recognize the fact that in order to get the United States out, or to get the United States to at the very least just leave them alone, they have to do this in terms of a full-blown conflict, right? They have to do this in terms of infiltrating the South, particularly in using the peasants in the rural countryside and pushing against the United States in any way possible. And their hope is that they can create such chaos again that the United States will be forced to concede the war and be forced to say, okay, you can have it. You can have Vietnam. You can have whatever it is that you want, and we're going to completely be gone. But they want to make sure that the United States is sort of staved off, and make sure that the United States just is not able to escalate the conflict any further. They want to make sure that they can't do that in terms of particularly ground forces, right? So they want to make sure that they are able to leave it at the bombings and get victory before the United States can fully bring all of their might to Southeast Asia, right? And so they sort of set this sort of odd date of, okay, 1 year from now, right? Spring of 1965. This is when we're hoping. And they have an inkling that Johnson is thinking about by spring of 65 that he's going to be bringing in ground troops. And there's this idea, there's a lot of intelligence that's floating around, and there's a lot of intelligence that the North Vietnamese have gotten for themselves that points to the idea that the United States is going to be bringing in ground troops. And so the North Vietnamese are like, we have to make sure that we can end this conflict before the might of the United States descends upon us. Well, most historians see the escalation of the Vietnam conflict as twofold. There's sort of two different phases, right? A regular bombing that's going on in terms of North Vietnam, these mass bombings that we were talking about, right? And then the introduction of U.S. ground troops to South Vietnam. So it's sort of twofold, right? It's these two different phases. I would suggest to you, because I'm always about challenging the existing historiography, I would suggest to you, see what you think about this in terms of where you would pin escalation, right? Because, of course, sending troops on the ground is a significant point of escalation. Aren't these sort of carpet bombings that go on in terms of the North? Isn't that even just the introduction of regular bombing and then moving to that, isn't that a major point of escalation? Do you even need to think about the idea of U.S. ground troops? So it's a point of escalation, but isn't that a definition of escalation to me might be just that first initial phase, because just the regular bombing is such a different tactic for the United States to use in terms of the North. It is the initial infiltration of the United States into the North, and escalation of the conflict in a way that we didn't think we were actually going to see, right? And we certainly didn't think we were going to see ground troops. So just kind of define that for yourself. And again, I'm not saying one or the other is right or wrong. I think it's George Herring that actually brings up this idea of the two different phases for historians, that they see it as a twofold process. And so just sort of look at it for yourself, and as you go through the course, make up your mind about these things that sort of are definitively presented to you in terms of the narrative or in terms of the historiography, and suggest, if you agree, great, and if you don't, suggest something new, okay? And suggest what you would see as a definition of escalation. Well, ideally for the United States in the moment, the reason for escalation is that they want to force the North Vietnamese into leaving the South and, pulling its support from any of the insurgents in the South. So that's the ideal reason for escalating, right? That's not the reason why the United States actually escalates the conflict. The escalation for the United States at this point in time, as we move into the winter of early 1965, is that another coup occurs. And so for the same exact reason that the North Vietnamese had ramped up their participation in this conflict, that we'll see the United States ramp theirs up even more because of the same reason, yet another coup. And so you can see the significant instability, and I know you've been sort of looking at this all week, the significant instability of the South and the inability of the United States to be able to not only rein in the elite leaders, but also to build a very strong South Vietnamese army, right? So we see this chaos that's occurring, and this turmoil that's occurring in the South. And so the United States suggests to itself, we need to step things up. And so we were hoping to step things up and maybe not even have to do this, but if we had to do it, it would be because we were close to getting the North Vietnamese to leave the South. We were close to getting the North Vietnamese to stop supporting the insurgents in the rural countryside. But the real reason why they escalate in early 1965 and certainly into the spring of 1965 is because of the significant turmoil that we see in the South. So the plans of the United States for escalation in that ideal situation, right? The ideal situation that they'll be throwing the North Vietnamese away from South Vietnam and making sure that they don't infiltrate the South at all, and that they're making sure that the supply lines are cut between the North Vietnamese and those insurgents in the South, so that that hopeful fantasy that the United States has created for itself. That escalation plan is something that the United States starts working on in the fall, winter of 1964. And that's before that coup that I mentioned. And so the United States they have these different phases that they're thinking about in terms of escalating this conflict as they move toward that fantasy goal, right? And so their first hope is to cut North Vietnamese supply routes. And the North Vietnamese obviously have now moved into Laos, and they are trying to circumvent any ability for the United States to hit their supply routes that are moving between the North and the South, those direct lines, right? So they've decided to circumvent that and to go and spread out into Laos and then come in to the south of Vietnam to bring supplies. The other thing that the United States is focusing on in this initial phase is that they're going to consistently do this tit-for-tat bombing, right? And the retaliatory hits that they're going to push onto the North, and that they're going to be in very strategic places, right? And they really stick with this for a long time, this idea of strategic targets, which would seem like a very important thing to do. And certainly in terms of warfare, this is what what the United States and many other places, but in thinking about the United States and I would say, like, say World War II, right? That there were the strategic hits in terms of the atomic bomb, right? We had to hit them strategically, that they weren't trying to decimate the entirety of Japan, that it was very important to hit these strategic areas. And of course, they were population centers too, so they were kind of killing two birds with one stone in terms of the atomic bomb. So they weren't just hitting militarily strategic or economically strategic places. They were also hitting them in terms of the numbers, right? Because that was the whole point of the dropping of the atomic bomb, was to stave off any sort of war on the Japanese mainland, where the United States felt that it would be outnumbered. And so, we see the United States throughout time and throughout its history really focusing on this idea of strategic targets, but it doesn't always work for the United States, and it's certainly not going to work in terms of this conflict. And the main reason why is those main strategic targets are really important, obviously, but the North Vietnamese are very good at sort of having these networks throughout North Vietnam, and then again, as we mentioned, into Laos. So in terms of hitting strategic targets, is really difficult for the United States to hit all of the strategic targets. It's very difficult for the United States to see anything but those more traditional strategic targets that they're used to focusing on in terms of bombing. And so the United States is, at this point in time, sort of setting itself up for the concerns of, we're not really focusing on how to change with our understandings of the North and what the North is doing. The United States has a really, really difficult time doing that. And we know this in terms of this war. It's one of the reasons why we quote-unquote lost it, right? This idea that the United States is just not, it really doesn't have the ability, which is not something that the United States is known for up to this point. The United States doesn't have the ability to sort of think on the fly here and to learn what it is that is going on in the conflict. And the United States is having a very difficult time sort of evolving in terms of the conflict and changing tactics. And this is something that we haven't seen in terms of the United States military up until this point, because even in World War II, the United States was very flexible. And within military history, military historians suggest that the United States had felt that it hit the jackpot in World War II, and why change, right? And so why change strategies? And so we see the United States hang on to strategies for longer than needed, and for enough time that it has a really harmful impact on the objectives of the United States military, that they're just holding on too long to this. And we see this a lot in the Vietnam conflict. We see this a lot in terms of the United States just not being able to go with the flow. And when the United States does try to go with the flow, it just isn't based on the best information in terms of what's really going on the ground, right? Like, the United States really has a really hard time in this conflict figuring out what the North Vietnamese are doing and sort of bending to that, and figuring out, how they can change policies, change strategies in order to combat that. And so even though there are changes in policy, it often is not the appropriate change. And so we're going to see this a lot from this point forward. And so in this ideal situation of escalation, and why the United States is thinking about escalation and inching toward this sort of massive escalation here, that we see that the United States really, this is where the seeds of these issues in the Vietnam conflict come from, right? This is where they're spread. And so the United States is sort of set in its ways in terms of how it's going to carry out this war and this conflict with the North. So their idea is that in this first month, we're going to have these significant bombings, retaliatory hits, tit for tat bombing, and then there'll be stabilization after that because the strategic targets have been hit, supply lines have been cut, and the North Vietnamese are going to be scrambling for equipment, right? They're going to be scrambling for new ways of combating the United States, and in the eyes of the United States, they're not going to be able to do it, right? And so they're going to, after this stabilization, they're going to start a large-scale air offensive against the North Vietnamese, hit them for about 2 to 6 months, depending on what is needed, maybe have a naval blockade, and then push in ground troops to clean it up. Kind of reminds you of the first Iraq War, right? This idea that the Gulf War was the United States went in there, won it in the air, and then came in, and the ground troops were kind of the cleanup crew, right? And so for this ideal situation of escalation, the United States, has these step-by-step plans, right? But are very bad at changing those plans on the fly. And so when Operation Rolling Thunder is put into place, it is a response to the coup, right? And so in the early winter of 1965, we see that the United States sort of jumps because of the fact that there's the coup, there's this significant chaos in the South, which is pretty much always there, and they're really concerned that the North is going to take advantage of that chaos, and so they push toward full-scale bombing in the North, whether or not that is the right tactic to use or not. So when, like I mentioned before, when the United States is making these decisions to change and making these decisions to they think they're doing it on the fly, right? They think that they're able to manipulate the situation, or they're able to take what's going on in terms of the North Vietnamese and say points of infiltration in the South, whatever it is that's actually occurring, that the United States thinks that it's able to bend with that, and they're able to change things on the fly. But often, like I mentioned, when they change these things, they're not the best ideas, and these full-scale attacks that occur in the North only intensify the escalation of the North Vietnamese army. It only intensifies the hatred of the insurgents in the South toward the United States, and also toward the South Vietnamese sympathizers. And so every step the United States makes along the way here in terms of its own escalation, especially in the mid-1960s, is that we see that it's met toe for toe, head to head, by the North Vietnamese and then some. So we've moved from the fantasy stage, right, and the planning of the United States military and the government in terms of meeting that fantasy objective, right? Waiting for things to be going on the ground, waiting to see where the moment is for them to strike in terms of the North Vietnamese, to push them away from the South, and also to cut the supply lines into the South, and that being the those major objectives, but that the United States is only planning to move toward those major objectives. They haven't really implemented everything, and then the coup changes everything, and we have Operation Rolling Thunder that occurs because of it. And so the United States in the actual implementation of escalation, as I mentioned, is not always, the smoothest transition, and it's not always the best ideas, right? And so what actually happens with this escalation, Operation Rolling Thunder, is that Lyndon Johnson just lets go of it, right? He just basically like lets the power, he sort of unleashes the power and the might of the United States on the North Vietnamese. And he does this in terms of the bombings and the mass bombings and the carpet bombings. And so, he permits the American military, a lot of, it basically gives them a lot of leeway in terms of bombings, not in many other ways, but in terms of bombings, and gives them the right to bomb other things other than the strategic targets that we talked about. He also clears the way for the use of napalm. And then he also gives, significant freedom to the pilots that are flying these missions, and basically allows them to bypass their first targets if they're not something that can be hit, and to move on to other targets. And sometimes those other targets aren't already there for the pilot to choose, that it's something that the pilot then decides himself. And so in terms of these new freedoms that the American military is given, it really, again, like I said, it really unleashes the might of the United States on the North in terms of bombings, right? Especially think about like the use of napalm at this point. And so there's a lot of freedom that's given in terms of the bombing, but again, this looking at the enemy in the way that the United States does, that they're looking at this European enemy, right? They're basing everything off of the warfare that they have already been a part of and participated in. And more often than not, that had a very Western tone to it, right? And so for the Americans at this point in time, they're really not recognizing the fact that the more that you push the North Vietnamese, the more the North Vietnamese are going to push back against you. The more you push the insurgents of the South and the Viet Cong of the South, the more you're going to be pushed back against. And so this is really, a point in time for the United States where they're making major decisions, but those decisions don't always yield them the results that they had hoped. The introduction of ground troops was something that the United States recognized would be needed because of Operation Rolling Thunder. As I mentioned before in the previous slide, in hindsight now, there is this understanding that the United States didn't necessarily always anticipate the next thing, right? And that it wasn't always focused on how tough the North Vietnamese were, right? Or how tough the Viet Cong were. And so in terms of them recognizing, and the leaders of the United States recognizing that there would be heavy retaliatory attacks for those mass bombings in the North, the thesis really still holds true in terms of suggesting that the United States just didn't always have it together in terms of the enemy that they were fighting. Because yes, they recognized that there would be heavy retaliatory attacks, but what they didn't really recognize was how to implement the use of these troops, or didn't we really need a lot more than what we were initially committing. And so that's what I mean by that, is that the United States could anticipate many things, but they never necessarily anticipated it as well as they should have, and they really didn't necessarily look at the common enemy. And so a lot of people have discussed this post George Herring's America's Longest War, but George Herring really put it out there, that idea that the United States did not really look at the culture of the people that they were fighting, and they didn't just look at it in terms of, not really recognizing that they shouldn't get embroiled in this, and that they shouldn't get embroiled in maintaining colonialism via American-style imperialism, right? They didn't recognize that that was probably a bad idea. But he also suggests this in terms of it just not being, the United States just wasn't good at picking the right tactics to thwart the efforts of the North Vietnamese. And so the suggestion is, again, sure, we recognize, it's normal in terms of military strategy to recognize that there are going to be retaliatory attacks for what you do, whether you do it with ground troops or whether you do it with bombs. But what the United States often did was the military leaders of the United States that were working in South Vietnam, or eventually, particularly when we had the ground troops sent in, that often their hands were tied by very particular strategies that just didn't necessarily always make sense. And so for the United States, in terms of the ground troops, they really took sort of a middle ground. And they were told, and the American people were told, that they were being sent to protect major U.S. bases in the region. And so in using that as the policy, what ended up happening is that they were told that they could only undertake operations within 50 miles. So here those ground troops are, really planted around those major U.S. bases, and they can't go anywhere else, okay? And so this is, again, it's very simple to suggest the idea that ground troops would be needed, and it's very important for any sort of military strategy for us to recognize the fact that if you're going to use mass bombings, if you're going to do very significant strikes on very major areas and very strategic areas and places and locations in terms of your conflict, that you're going to get some pretty heavy retaliation, right? But it's the way that the United States responded to the retaliation that would be the issue, not that they recognized that there would be retaliation. That's a very simplistic understanding, right? We know there'll be retaliation. Certainly from the North Vietnamese there would be retaliation, or certainly the insurgents of the South would rise even more, right? The insurgents of the South would become even more implanted and become much more against the United States and, again, the South Vietnamese collaborators because of what the United States was doing. So yes, it's very obvious, but the United States didn't necessarily always create policies or implement policies that could be fruitfully used in Vietnam and against the North Vietnamese and against the Viet Cong. And so this is one of those situations, right, that seems very odd. And what I would like for you guys to think about is why you think that the United States chose to limit how the ground troops were used. So here the bombings that are taking place, the pilots are getting the ability to go to second targets, right? They can't hit the first target, so they're given the right to go to another target. Sometimes, often not even planned targets, right? Not planned in terms of here's your first one, your second one, your third one. That they're actually given the right to choose targets for themselves. But the ground troops that are there, their hands are somewhat being tied, right? And so I want you to kind of figure out what it is that you think that the United States is doing and why this is a problem, and recognize the fact that it's July of 1965, so it's not like it's the height of the protest movements, right? So why is it that the United States is limited in terms of what it does with the ground troops, and limited in terms of the freedoms that are given to the ground troops, or really limited in terms of the orders that the ground troops are given? That the orders are very, very, very limited, not just the fact that they're not given particular freedoms that say they would have been given in other wars. And so I want you to kind of think about that and why that's so significant. We know that it's significant in terms of the fact that the United States, it's going to obviously be much more difficult for the United States to win the conflict, right? But why is it that the United States has decided, and what really are the consequences before the fact that we know that the United States is going to have to withdraw from this conflict? So we see that the ground troops, we're looking at the ground troops as a way to sort of escalate the situation, but it's not really being escalated in any way that would suggest that the ground troops would be able to win the conflict, right? But we also want to look at the fact that there is this significant concerted effort to allow for there to be more ground troops. So we know that there's a possibility that there's going to be an expansion of what's going on in terms of the ground. So recognize that too, that there's kind of this their eyes on larger strategies. But recognize that in terms of why is there limited strategy at this point, and what would it take for the United States to break out of these limited strategies? So as mentioned, the United States is clearly aware that the North Vietnamese will retaliate, and there will be heavy and pretty strong retaliation against the United States because of the bombings and because of Operation Rolling Thunder. But again, we recognize the fact that the United States doesn't necessarily see the larger consequences of the bombings, and that the United States doesn't necessarily understand how intense the retaliation will be. And so at this point in time for the North Vietnamese, they really dig in. They really, really dig into the conflict. And they intensify, strengthen many of the tactics that they have already been using. And so they're just really good at the act of hiding things. They're really good, not just people. They're really, really good at hiding military and really large, like industrial equipment that's helping them to maintain their economy. And so they hide these large objects, and look at the strategic bombing, right? Like the strategic bombing is just something that they can sort of thumb their nose at the United States or laugh at them and be like, oh, you didn't find anything. Like you went to these strategic sites and you hit us, but guess what? Everything's been moved, right? Everything's in hiding. And so the North Vietnamese they're ridiculously good at hiding what it is that they have, like hiding what type of equipment they have, hiding the fact that they do have equipment to help them in terms of economic production too. And so the United States is unaware of what's going on, and so they think that they are hitting these major strategic targets and decimating them in terms of the North Vietnamese, decimating them with they don't have the ability to regenerate, right? They don't have the ability to regenerate in terms of equipment. Well, they don't need to regenerate in terms of equipment because the equipment's not being hit. The other thing that the North Vietnamese are very good at is using their numbers. And the term ant labor is something that people use for the North Vietnamese, and the fact that they have all of these networks of people that work in North Vietnam to repair infrastructure after bombing, to move the equipment, to hide the equipment, to use the equipment. And so there's these interconnected networks, and that's why they call it ant labor. This is these interconnected networks of people that are able to make sure that North Vietnam keeps moving forward in terms of this war, right, in terms of this conflict. And so the United States is unaware of a lot of this, and the United States is unaware of what's going on in terms of how well the North Vietnamese were at mobilizing their people, and what they mobilized them for, I think is the larger issue, right? Also, the North Vietnamese dig in terms of defensive airstrikes. They have surface-to-air missiles, jet fighters, as I put here, occasionally. Well, where did they get that? Oh, well, obviously they got it from the Chinese and from the Soviets, right? And so the United States they're obviously concerned about this region becoming a satellite of China and the USSR. but not necessarily always recognizing just how much help the North Vietnamese are getting from the Chinese and from the Soviets. And so they're getting tons of money, they're getting tons of equipment, and actually, in terms of the Chinese, they get troops. So to further my argument regarding the inability of the United States to always, make their objectives come to fruition, or to be able to use their strategies and tactics to make their objectives come to fruition. We ask the question, and often historians and military historians and strategists often ask this question of whether the intensified bombings actually worked, because again, as I suggest and as I argue, that really allows for the North Vietnamese to really dig in, right? And in terms of the positives here, there was a slowing down in terms of the North Vietnamese military, and obviously they have to spend more time moving equipment, and their energies are being spread out more, and they are able, in terms of the United States, to cut off some of the supply lines, but again, the North Vietnamese are able to circumvent that going through Laos. But in terms of the negatives, the negatives really outweigh the positives here, because the United States is spending a lot of money. And the United States has already been spending a lot of money, have been spending it for years, even while the French were there, right? And so now we are into the billions in terms of what we're spending and have spent in terms of the Vietnam conflict. And we really don't have a lot to show for it, right? At best, it's a stalemate, right? And it really isn't. And the North Vietnamese really are able to often appear to have the upper hand, and they're able to actually manipulate that to illustrate that they have the upper hand even when they don't. And we'll talk about that in terms of Tet, which is coming up. But these negatives, I think, especially in terms of bad publicity, the publicity is bad internationally too. We always think about it in terms of the United States and in terms of the home front, right? We think about the bad publicity that the conflict is getting, and that the American public doesn't support what's going on, does not even understand why the United States is there in Southeast Asia. But the publicity is bad internationally. And so, as we're going to see, as the United States moves through this conflict, and as the conflict ends with the withdrawal of the United States, and then the things that happen to Vietnam as a whole after the United States leaves, that we see the ball rolling here and starting to roll in terms of bad publicity. And so the intensified bombings, you can really make the argument that they don't work, and that they really allow for an escalation, a further escalation of the conflict that maybe the United States really didn't fully think out. And again, recognizing that they did understand that there would be retaliation, but just really didn't understand that the bombings were going to push the North Vietnamese even harder, to work even harder. And that there's just a lot of tactics and a lot of strategies that the United States knows about and doesn't know how to combat, or it knows about them or it doesn't know about them, rather. So it either knows about them and can't combat them, or they just don't know. And so it really shows that the United States has more. The negatives are much more intense than the positives here, right, in terms of the bombings. As you've no doubt seen in the documentary, and certainly read about in the book, William Westmoreland was the commander of United States forces during this period of the conflict. And Westmoreland is seen in history as the commander who lost, quote unquote, lost the conflict for the United States. There were a lot of different arguments that can be made as to whether Westmoreland lost it or Johnson lost it, and it's probably a little bit of everything, right? But in terms of Westmoreland, if you know anything about how the National Security Council, the United States military, and the presidency worked post World War II. You'll recognize that it was in this period of time, and that period between the Second World War and now the Vietnam conflict, that the presidency had garnered for itself a great deal of power, and the administration had garnered itself a great deal of power, whatever administration was in place, in telling the commanders of foreign wars what to do and how to do it. And so one of the arguments and greater arguments of this war, and greater I mean larger arguments of this war, is that the hands of the commander in Vietnam, that his hands, whoever it would be, were tied. And so in suggesting this about Westmoreland, we see that Westmoreland always felt, and this is something that he would say until the day he died, was that Johnson was controlling everything, and that anything that he wanted to do, any objectives that he had, were often met with a great deal of conflict because, number one, as I'm sure you've already figured out, there was a great deal of conflict within the Johnson administration itself as to what kind of policies should be used, what kind of tactics should be used. So you have that conflict, and then you have Johnson being concerned about what the greater, larger American public thought about what was going on. And so Westmoreland in some ways was right, that there was so much conflict and turmoil within the Johnson administration in terms of what should be done in Vietnam, but that things had changed so much in terms of who was really calling the shots in a war or a conflict post-World War II, that it became very difficult for any commander to make sure that the main objectives were met, or it became very difficult for any commander to be able to force an administration to meet new objectives. And so Westmoreland's objectives can always be seen as, you would have to study him a little bit more, but they can always be seen in one of two lights, that they were absolutely exactly what Westmoreland wanted, or they were things that were being forced upon him. There was never really a middle ground there. And Westmoreland really wanted the war of attrition. And he believed that using the war of attrition, as many would, we talk about this in terms of the Civil War, that it would force the North Vietnamese into negotiations. And here's where that comes in again, that you really need to understand your enemy, right? Because it wasn't going to force the North Vietnamese into negotiations for many reasons. One, out of their just sheer desire to thwart a Western enemy, but also that the United States just didn't realize how the North Vietnamese were really handling this war. Westmoreland had three very main objectives for the negotiations too, and very particular objectives in terms of how he wanted this conflict to turn out, and that was that he wanted the North to be thwarted in its efforts to give assistance, give training to the Southern insurgents. He wanted to destroy the Viet Cong, and obviously this is what the United States had been working for all along, that he wanted the Southern Republic to be able to really flourish, to get control from the peasantry and from the Viet Cong, and to sort of create a republic for just the South in the image of the United States. And then again, the larger objective for anybody who was involved in this particular period of time was that they wanted to prevent international communism from embedding itself in the region, and this was thwarting the Chinese and their intervention was really what was on the mind of Westmoreland. He was much less concerned, at least in this area, about the USSR versus the Chinese, right? Like he really, and I think rightfully so in terms of proximity, right? That the Chinese were the greater enemy here and the greater issue, and also recognizing the fact that the Chinese were really helpful to the North Vietnamese, and as I mentioned, even sending troops. So we have this, this U.S. commander who he was a very smart man, and he was very good at military strategy. He was also very vain and often egotistical too. So a lot of, and I'm not sure how many other commanders historically haven't been, but he really was someone who got an idea in his head and really wasn't able to let go of it as to what he wanted or how that was going to occur. And so that just created pretty consistent butting of heads, right? If we're talking about there being a change in this apparatus that is making decisions in terms of warfare for the United States, that is the way that Westmoreland carried himself really would not mesh with that, right? Because the commanders were getting less and less control, and that made Westmoreland very, very angry. And he always felt like every effort that he had was thwarted, and he very rarely, although they saw eye to eye about what they wanted, Johnson and Westmoreland rarely saw eye to eye in terms of how the United States could attain what they wanted, right? So Westmoreland's a very interesting character. I know you see him a great deal in the documentary, but Lewis Sorley has a really good biography of William Westmoreland, and Westmoreland's life becomes sort of a tragedy in terms of him spending a great deal of the rest of his life trying to clear his name from the Vietnam conflict, and to trying to clear his men's name as well. And really felt that he was, a lot of people say, oh, he's just doing it for himself, but I really do believe he was also doing it for his men too. So in terms of Westmoreland, he's a really important figure to recognize in terms of this war. In terms of the Vietnamese response in the South, because of the intensified bombings and because of the United States and their introduction of ground troops, recognize that this again really causes the North Vietnamese to dig in, and they go, full blown in terms of their war of aggression against the United States, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail really gets rolling at this point in time. So that line of supplies, communications, equipment, all of that is really on a roll on the Ho Chi Minh Trail between the North and the South. So a final major point here in terms of the escalation of the conflict is that in North Vietnam, don't think that it was always cut and dry how things were going to play out, right? And what kind of tactics and strategies should be used. Much like the United States, there was some division. And the obviously we know that Ho Chi Minh and his most ardent followers had really pushed this idea of massive retaliation, this aggression against the United States, and really pushed that escalation, that initial escalation. But we also know that within the military and within the ranks of the military, that there was a concern about, really being aggressive and being way too aggressive in terms of warfare. And so the decision and the hope was to have a long and drawn out conflict, again, so that it would be so protracted that the United States would have to pull out eventually. And so don't, number one, think that the North was not divided in terms of what it saw as the best approach to take, but also recognize the fact that even though there was pretty significant aggressive warfare, there was also the hope that the warfare could be tempered in a way that really drug things out for the United States. And I would suggest that this is obviously what happened, right? And I think they did a really good job, unfortunately, of being able to be highly aggressive, but also to be able to create this protracted war. And so North Vietnam really had a strong handle, even in its divisions, a really strong handle on how things should play out. Note that there's a great deal of propaganda that's going on to boost the morale of the Northerners, who were also already extremely loyal. And so there's this push of nationalism, push that relates what they're doing back to not just throwing off the yoke of French colonization, but also Chinese colonization. So there's a lot of tradition involved in their propaganda, and a lot of honor going on in their propaganda too. It's kind of a side note there, but certainly something to recognize in terms of how North Vietnam was able to sustain itself through this protracted war. Let's discuss a little bit regarding the consequences of the United States strategic decisions during this period. And I think I've probably talked about this one enough, but this idea that the United States really overestimated the kind of effect that its military could have on the North Vietnamese, overestimating in terms of what they thought were hoping, or they were hoping would happen, right? That the North Vietnamese would fold, and so they underestimated the effect of the military in terms of it turning the Northerners against the United States even further, right? And really embedding them in this hatred. And the United States really never would overcome that sort of arrogance of overestimating that the North Vietnamese would just, recoil in horror that the American machine of the military had descended upon them, right? And so it's really just something that they never really got it through their heads through the whole conflict. And maybe that's a result of World War II, right? Maybe that's a result of all of the successes of World War II and just, coming off of that high there, that there was some arrogance going on. It also has a great deal to do with race. It has a great deal to do with this being a region that had already been colonized, and how the French had perceived the North Vietnamese as inferior. And obviously they passed that along to the United States, this suggestion that there was racial inferiority going on, right? So this inability to understand that there wouldn't be the reaction that they had hoped to the might of the American military. It really affects strategy, because again, the strategy becomes really arrogant. There's not a lot of examination that's being done, and certainly not in relation to the enemy, right, and what the enemy's really like. They were always miscalculating things, and so often things were going awry, and that would be reported back into the United States, and then U.S. support, citizen support, kept falling further. So there's a lot to be said about this rather arrogant belief that of the United States military and government, that the American military would be able to just get in there, sort of show their teeth, and the North Vietnamese would be afraid, and they weren't. And obviously, as we've suggested in this course, they've been doing this a long time, right? Well before the French. So there are a lot of consequences here. So let's move on to the next slide, where we talk about a few others, and then we'll move along to the end of the lecture. And then finally here we have this idea of limited warfare, right? So first the United States thinks, it'll show its teeth. The North Vietnamese will run, and that will be that. And obviously, when that doesn't happen, the United States realizes that it's basically stuck there, and it has to figure out how it's going to push back the North Vietnamese and rout out the insurgents in the south. And consistently, there are some iffy decisions made, right? And we've talked about this in terms of limited war with the ground troops. So the limitations that are placed on the ground troops and the limitations that are just placed on a commander like Westmoreland really assured the fact that the United States really wouldn't have the victory that it wanted as quickly as it wanted it, like the war of attrition that Westmoreland talked about. But some historians suggest that it didn't allow the United States, this limited war idea, didn't allow the United States to project military might in the way that it could have. I don't agree with that personally, because I think that the bombings alone were really showing the North Vietnamese what the United States was made of in terms of its power, but it had the opposite effect, right? But again, there are some that argue that the limitations placed on the military meant that they couldn't project the kind of power that the United States had and has, right? So think again about that in terms of the historiography here. And what side you come down on in terms of the historiography, but how you would, particularly in terms of a slide like this, how would you use evidence to prove one way or another in terms of this idea of military might? Was it projected? Was it not? How was it received, right? So just recognize the fact that there are certain things in any class that aren't really agreed upon in the historiography, and that's the beauty of the historiography too, is that it not only is malleable, but it also is it's living and breathing, but it when it lives and breathes, it sometimes argues, right? It changes a lot and can change, but there are significant arguments and debates within the historiography, and that's probably the most fun part of historiography. But recognize that as you're looking at narratives, right? That narratives are often interpretations too. There are only very specific things within a narrative that are true, right? The locations, actors that are present, right? Dates, things like that. Those are your only real facts, right? Everything else is interpretation, and some of it is really well studied interpretation that is then, clearly canonized, and everybody agrees upon it. And sometimes it's never, ever argued against. And then other times we have debates that are they're just never settled, right? And so this is one of them here in terms of the Vietnam War, that, was the military might projected? Was it not projected? And what were the consequences of that, right? Also, there's this discussion, not only in the historiography, but certainly within the American military, that the fact that the military really didn't have a lot of in-the-field guidelines meant that the military was making really conventional choices. I would also suggest that it was making choices that, kind of like, what are we supposed to do, right? What should we do? And what kind of pushback are we going to get from the higher-ups in Washington, and particularly Johnson and, say, someone like Robert McNamara, right? But I would really suggest the more important point here is that the frustration over limited war is really going to create a problem, a significant wedge between the U.S. military and future administrations, this administration, Johnson's administration, and future administrations. That there's this push back and forth between, who really has the right to make the decisions, who knows what about what's going on, and even though they're supposed to be working in tandem, they don't really do so, right? And so there's some pretty significant issues that occur even well beyond the Vietnam conflict, that suggest that this tug of war is something that's kind of impaired and impeded the American military. And here very quickly are your major points for the summary lecture. Obviously, this is all about escalation. And the United States had this ideal situation for escalation and the objective that they were working toward. And obviously, the political instability of the South really pushed them into escalation before they wanted to, and not necessarily anywhere near the objectives that they had set forth for themselves. Escalation then continues because of the Tonkin incident, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that the United States often thought about the fact that it wanted the North out of the South, and maybe would, even though the greater hope was to have the entirety of Vietnam in its own image, or the image that it had wanted, that it not necessarily was something that they always felt, that the American military or the administration always felt was something that could actually come to fruition. And so they really thought a lot about the idea of pushing the North out of the South. And so that there was this hope that maybe they could at least just salvage the South. And so that's something that I think that illustrates that at a certain point in time, yet rather early on in the conflict, that the United States military, the United States government realized that there was a significant problem in terms of being able to defeat the North Vietnamese, and to take the entirety of Vietnam as opposed to just the South. And then also I think probably the biggest point of the entire summary is that the intensified warfare, particularly the bombings of the North, led the North Vietnamese to really dig in and to be more aggressive. And even though, like I said, there were some debates on the level of aggression, it was still very aggressive even at its lowest levels, right? And so I think this is one of the biggest points of this whole period, is that the United States continued to escalate. And even though sometimes they felt like their hands were tied, the military thought their hands were tied and all of that, there still was very vicious escalation, right? Really intense escalation. And that intensity had the opposite effect that the United States wanted. That it didn't have the effect of the North Vietnamese running and hiding or surrendering. That it had the opposite effect, and that is that it intensified aggression toward the United States and toward the south of Vietnam. So that's where we are in terms of this week, and as we move forward, really focus on the fact that you have some really strong understandings now of how this conflict really came to a head. And now we're going to see from this point forward how it just starts to fall apart for the Americans. So I hope you enjoy the material for next week, because it starts getting really interesting from here on out, and a lot of interpretation, a lot of educated opinion that you can put into your work.